Hello, viewers, and welcome back to the Warfighter Archives, where we break down military history from the perspective of a combat veteran. Today, we are tackling one of the biggest myths of the Hundred Years' War, that being the French Knights. And who were they? What armor did they wear? And perhaps most importantly, were they even knights at all? And beyond that, we'll examine how the French adapted and evolved to eventually win this war. This is a fascinating topic and very under-discussed compared to the longbowmen, which is ironic because it's the French that eventually emerged victorious from this war. With that said, nothing in my videos is meant to say that so and so is wrong and I am right, or to say that my perspectives are the quote unquote correct perspectives. My goal is simply to open up further debate and discussion, so feel free to leave your thoughts and critiques in the comment section below. With that all said, let's go ahead and start diving into this topic. So, what might surprise a lot of you is that the term French knights is misleading. Most of the quote unquote knights were not knights at all, but rather men at arms. This distinction is important because knights were a distinct social class, whereas men at arms could come from many different backgrounds. Some of them were minor nobility, some of them were landed gentry, others were just wealthy commoners. Most critically, the two were paid differently. I think we all know that knights drew their income from land that was granted to them by their lord. Men at arms, on the other hand, were paid a wage. For the English, this was 1 shilling per day. For the French, it fluctuated between 20 and 40 dinars per day, with 40 dinars being roughly 1 shilling. This fluctuation is due to the difference in organization. English men at arms were paid via contract indenture from the crown, which set wages across the board, whereas French men at arms were paid by their local lord. Moreover, many men at arms were reliant on their lord for armor, especially squires, pages, and members of the household retinue. So, my question to you is this: would you rather pay what amounts to an on demand fee for your soldiers, or would you rather have to pay them year round? The fact is that most French nobles made the decision to hire men at arms when needed, as opposed to parceling out their land or paying substantially more year round for a large retinue of knights. Remember that many men at arms came from lower social classes, and so were willing to settle for a lower overall wage, while they could still perform pretty much all of the same functions on the battlefield. It's also important to note that a knight's squire and page, if the page was old enough, would often fight as men at arms. The book by David Nicole, laying out the French armies in the later portions of the Hundred Years' War, makes it clear that these men were often armored differently from a knight. But what did that look like? Let's go ahead and discuss the armor that was worn by men at arms. In fact, one of the most common questions from the Hundred Years' War is, could the longbow penetrate armor? And the first question that we need to ask in response is, what type of armor are you talking about? Remember that many men at arms were reliant on their lord for armor, and thus the type and quality of armor would vary depending on how much their lord was willing to invest in it. In fact, most French men at arms would have worn brigandine, at least at first, and this is supported very well by a lot of the archaeological evidence. But why would this matter? What's the difference between brigandine and plate armor? Well, the two armors are very different in construction. Plate armor's primary protection is a large, solid breastplate that covers the vital organs. Brigandine is a series of small metal plates sewn into a jacket or a gambeson. The small plates in Brigandine are usually thinner, and the gaps between them offer less protection than a solid breastplate. In addition, Brigandine was often made from metal scraps, which brings the overall quality into further question. Todd's Workshop has some great videos featuring arrows and bolts against both Brigandine and plate, which support the idea that Brigandine was probably less protective. This is especially true since a brigandine was very hard or impossible to quality test. To test a breastplate, you need to test one piece of metal, whereas to test a brigandine, you need to test multiple small plates, which was just not very practical, and testing smaller plates might actually damage them, even if they were proof against the initial hit. So, with these factors, one might ask, why was Brigandine even used? And there are two main answers to this question. The first was cost effectiveness, and the second is comfort. We'll go into both, but let's talk about cost effectiveness first. First of all, it's important to note that Brigandine isn't bad armor. It's quite good and protected well against most melee strikes, as well as most bows that were used on the continent at the start of the Hundred Years' War. From Alan Williams' excellent book, The Knight in the Blast Furnace, we can also see that Brigandine was much cheaper. In 1450, a Brigandine would cost around 10 to 15 livres. The armor for a noble knight, on the other hand, would be around 125 to 200 livres, while the cost for low quality plate armor, which would have been mass produced and relatively unadorned, was probably closer to 50 to 100. This would be in line with the English records, which show that a low cost plate armor in 1450 would cost around £6, while a brigandine would cost 16 shillings. So we see this as a huge cost difference, where the brigandine costs about a sixth of the cost of the plate armor. Also, remember that 1450 is over 100 years after Cressy. In 1346, plate armor was relatively uncommon and might have been more expensive or just more difficult to find. At this time, Brigandine was effective against most known threats and was about a sixth of the cost. And I ask you, what decision would you have made if you were French man at arms or the lord equipping his retinue? Would you pay 6 times more for plate armor when the brigandine is effective as far as you knew and a sixth of the cost? I think a lot of French nobles and men at arms opted for the cheaper brigandine. And then there was the comfort factor. And to be honest, I don't know why people act like comfort wasn't a big concern. Someone tell me in the comments section, please, why this is the case. As someone who spent 15 years in combat arms and security contracting, comfort is a huge factor in determining your preferred kit. If you think about it, you're going to be wearing your armor a lot more in non combat situations than in combat, and comfort becomes one of your main concerns. And I think this is a difference between a combat veteran's perspective and someone who wears armor for competitions or for reenactments. It's one thing to put on armor for a few hours of competition or fun, as opposed to having to wear it for 10 to 12 hours a day, multiple days in a row, while you're marching, riding, setting up camp, etc. I don't mind tossing on my plate carrier and going to the range for a few hours of shooting with my buddies. On the other hand, it was miserable putting it on for 10 to 12 hours of patrolling in palm groves south of Baghdad. It's just night and day, and there really isn't any comparison. But what other differences can you think of between competition and reenactment versus real combat? Well, one of the things that comes to mind is that in competition, you know when your fights will be, and there are rules. No one can run up to you as you wait for your fight and crack you over the head with a poleaxe. In real combat, enemies make an effort to attack you when you are most disadvantaged. This means that you don't get the same opportunities to remove your armor and rest as you might in a tournament environment. This is highly relevant to the Brigandine versus plate armor debate. Think about it. Brigandine, as a jacket, was quick to don and doff. Plate armor, on the other hand, often took multiple people an extended period of time to put on. Once it was off, if you got attacked suddenly, you might not have a chance to put it on again, and armor that you're not wearing is pretty much useless. And this balance of comfort, ease of use, and effectiveness is why Brigandine was so popular throughout the late Middle Ages, even if it wasn't as protective as plate armor. But with that said, could a man at arms afford plate armor if he wanted it? And to figure this out, we need to consider the income of the average man at arms, and I'll apologize here for going into a bunch of numbers. For the French, we'll go with the high end of about 40 dinars a day for wages, and keep in mind that 240 dinars equals a livre. So a suit of brigandine at the low end would be 10 livres, would take about 60 days of wages to pay for. A suit of plate armor, let's say on the low end again, that would be around 50 livres. It would take 250 to 300 days of wages. And this is actually a little bit misleading. The reality is that soldiers throughout history are notoriously bad at saving money. This is in large part because almost every military establishment throughout history is surrounded by businesses whose goal is to relieve soldiers of money as quickly as the soldiers can make it. After payday, soldiers go to these businesses to avail themselves of nice food, good drink, and paid companionship. And so by the time a man at arms got done drinking, eating, dicing, and paying for female friendship, he probably had run through a substantial portion of his pay. So, with this said, a man at arms could afford plate armor, especially if he got lucky in battle and took a high value prisoner or a substantial amount of plunder. However, this would be highly dependent on him being involved in a battle, which was by no means a guarantee, and on his luck in said battle. So, while it was certainly possible, it was not at all easy. For lords, the question was centered more around cost effectiveness, and we see a shift here as the Hundred Years' War continues. As they get more experience dealing with English longbows, more French lords start equipping their men with plate armor, especially as mass produced plate from places like Milan became more available. The last thing that I wanted to discuss in terms of equipment is the topic of horse armor, and I've seen this in several discussions of French men at arms. Firstly, I think it's important to note that it's pretty well accepted that at Crécy, the French did not have horse armor, and this was probably a contributing factor to their defeat. English arrows probably tore through their ranks, throwing riders and disrupting the charge, and yet, even later in the war, we still don't see much mention of horse armor, even though we know it existed, and the question is why? To answer this question, we once again come back to the cost benefit analysis. Is it worth paying hundreds of livres for horse armor that you may well not have a chance to actually put on the horse before battle? Horse armor is heavy and it's hot. Sheets of metal over a heavy gambeson is going to make the horse heat up pretty fast. Therefore, it couldn't be worn day to day for long movements. It was also difficult to put on. Usually, it took multiple people, and it's important to remember that time is a finite resource, especially in warfare. It's also important to note that a lot of medieval war revolved around these fast moving raids and trying to counter them, and in these situations, horse armor was simply impractical. However, we do see horse armor becoming somewhat more common as the Hundred Years' War continues, and this again probably represents the changing cost benefit analysis. In 1346, most enemy archers had relatively short ranged weapons. Cavalry at a gallop could cover this range very quickly, at which point the archer's ability to injure the horse becomes significantly less, especially since said archer is probably dealing with a lance embedded in his chest cavity. However, English longbows had greater range and greater hitting power, so that equation started to shift. Suddenly, armoring your horse seems like a better idea because you're being engaged from a greater range with more powerful weapons. However, even then, we don't see it that commonly, and this is likely due to the difficulties in putting it on in time for battle versus the time a man at arms actually had for preparation. Finally, we get to the last part of our video here where we talk about tactics. And I think here we need to ask, why did the French fail so badly at the start of the conflict? We'll go into the tactical failures and the reason in a minute, but first, let's talk about how a French army was actually raised for battle. Throughout the Hundred Years' War, French armies were generally raised via a feudal levy or by the arrière-ban. This was a method that basically called all able bodied men to arms for a relatively short period of free feudal service, which was usually about 40 days, after which the king would have to start paying them. And this is important to consider. Firstly, this is a hastily raised army that doesn't have a lot of time to work or train together. Men at arms coming from the same retinue probably do have experience together, but they don't have a lot of experience serving in the army or even with the other men at arms in their own battle. Battle is a large French unit. There were usually 3 battles to an army. Secondly, the French were incentivized to engage the enemy quickly, since if they passed a period of feudal obligations, they must start to pay wages to the army. This could be a massive strain on finances, especially since the English were doing a very good job of pillaging and looting the French countryside, which obviously made it significantly harder for the French lords to raise money. These factors combined in the major English victories at places like Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt. In each case, the French army hastily engaged the English on ground that the English chose. In each case, poor discipline on the part of the French played a significant role in their defeat. For example, at Crécy, there's a lot of evidence that the French men at arms may have started the battle on their own, thereby voiding the king's plan to rest his army and attack the next day. Also, we need to consider the tactics that men at arms were trained for, and on a basic level, the French men at arms were trained primarily for one tactic, and that was the heavy cavalry charge. We often think of this as a very simple tactic, and that's completely incorrect. A cavalry charge is tactically complex as it requires careful maintaining of formation that preserves maximum weight of impact, and it also requires careful timing. Your goal is to hit the enemy with horses at a dead sprint. This generates a ton of impact that will literally hurl a man on foot to the ground, possibly with severe injuries. This requires very careful timing because if you hit that sprint too soon, the horses will tire and slow down. And if you order it too late, the horses won't have time to hit full speed, and you'll also be exposed to enemy missile fire for a lot longer. It also requires relatively flat, open ground to be effective, since sprinting your horse into a ditch or a pit is going to be an uncomfortable experience for both you and the horse. The English knew this and took steps to fortify their positions against this tactic. They often set up on elevated ground and used battlefield fortifications such as pits, sharpened stakes, etc., to break the momentum and impact of the French charge. The normal counter to a fortified enemy is to outflank that position. However, flanking requires a good degree of tactical competency as well as command and control. Your flanking commander needs to not only understand the battlefield, but also know the army commander's strategic intent. Careful coordination is a must, otherwise, one part of the army might attack too soon, be isolated, and easily destroyed. Moreover, by splitting your army, you make both parts more vulnerable to a sudden attack from the enemy force. In addition, sources indicate that the French were overconfident in their armor and combat prowess. This is actually a theme with French armies across the Middle Ages, from the Holy Land to Nicopolis to the Hundred Years' War. It's also a fault that undoes many armies throughout military history, such as the Wehrmacht in Russia. If you combine this overconfidence with a lack of tactical finesse and command and control, well, I think you can see why it's not surprising that the French suffered numerous defeats early on in the Hundred Years' War. However, as the conflict continues, we start to see the French adapt tactically. We see the French fight dismounted and defensively more often. We also see a higher degree of coordination with other elements in the army, such as artillery. In fact, the French embraced battlefield artillery as an answer to English tactics, and eventually men at arms working in coordination with artillery won the stunning French victory at Castillon, often called Crécy in reverse. French artillery blasted the English off the battlefield, and it can be argued that England's position in France was doomed from that point on. Notably, we also see the French adopt more professionalized forces, such as the gendarmes, in the aftermath of the Hundred Years' War. I hope this shows that French men at arms were much more than knights in shining armor charging blindly at English archers. Instead, they were a diverse, evolving force drawn from different social classes, equipped with various levels of armor, and learning crucial lessons from repeated battlefield setbacks. Over time, the French adapted, improving their armor, refining their tactics, and moving toward a more professionalized military. By the later stages of the war, their use of dismounted tactics, battlefield artillery, and improved coordination between different arms led to victories that reversed the early dominance of the English. The story of the French men at arms is therefore one of adaptation, resilience, and learning from defeat. From those humiliating defeats to eventual victory, they proved one of the essential truths in military history. Those who evolve survive. And in the end, they didn't just survive, they won.